Abbas, thank you very, very much. Joy to be here. Paul, thank you very much. It's good to be among at least some epidemiologists, and I hope you're not scared too much about my title. Why are epidemiologists so bad at epidemics? You will see that it, to a certain degree, refers to Alzheimer's disease, a little bit to COVID, but more to something else, which is particularly ongoing in the US. I will speak about matters that are hopefully of interest to you from an epidemiologic perspective. And I could also have called this talk the uses of epidemiology. Why do we do epidemiology? And I'd like to go back then a number of centuries, 4th century BCE. This is Hippocrates, of course. This is a bust that was made 7 centuries later, so I'm not sure it really reflects him, but he phrased, we think, and it's, I think, reasonable to say so when we look at the writings of the group of Hippocrates, he phrased the first four big questions in medicine. Eternal questions. Doctor, what do I have? Diagnosis. Why? Etiology, causes. Where do I go? Prognosis. And can you do something about it? Treatment. You can basically all questions in medicine, biomedicine, but also social medicine, you can phrase in those terms. I rephrased it a little bit and talk about the uses of Hippocratic epidemiology. Diagnosis is the big picture. Epidemiologists, in principle, are good at the big picture. Etiology is about, of course, causes. Very big and important topic. Prediction these days, of course, of great interest. And in fact, the title of this meeting refers to that. And then action. What can we do? And I would like this 35 or so minutes talk particularly about the big picture, how we work in that. And I start with one of my predecessors. Not many know him, but he is really very remarkable. John Gordon, professor and chair of epidemiology at Harvard, before the Second World War started. And then he went to Europe. He worked mainly in Romania, was also just after the Second World War in Germany, and then came back. And he said that epidemiology is the diagnostic discipline of mass disease in 1942. It was very much a focus of that in that era. I would say something like the first or second era of epidemiology. And then came what we called at that time new epidemiology. And a great person, not sure we read him very much, but perhaps we should, is Jerry Morris here in London. And this is Uses of Epidemiology, really a great book. 7 functions, 7 uses of epidemiology, and Morris specified, here's the book, it's my copy, specified 7, as I said, seven functions, and said that in 1957, basically the first textbook in epidemiology as a bridge between clinical medicine and preventive medicine. He focused very much on population diagnosis is the main topic of this book, together with causation, and very much therefore on descriptive epidemiology. Now, that is what the big picture is about. It's description, descriptive epidemiology. And I, of course, would like to start then with how can we describe? We can describe when we have data, and that starts here as well. Here also, in this country, although the first data of this nature came from France, but this is the first systematized data, and the bills of mortality, of course, is generally when we these days say that epidemiology started. Second half of the 17th century, when we have the first detailed analyses of mortality by category, for example, of where you live or your gender or whatever. Quite a number of very detailed analyses. This is what it provides us with. This is, I think, of all the slides I've seen in quite a number of years now, my favorite slide. This is John Uppen and John Vaupel, to demographers working in Germany, but Jim Coppell was American, died a year ago or so. Now, many years ago, 2002, they published this paper in Science in which they looked at life expectancy at birth in record countries. And what you see here is from an average of about 35 when we have the first data in record countries. This was France first and then Britain. 35, starting in about 1800, Industrial Revolution, goes up straight slope, 0.25, every 4 years, 1 year increase in life expectancy. Every 4 years, 1 year increase in life expectancy. My summary for this is, you live a week and you gain a weekend. Very, very remarkable. And this is also went on after 2002. I deliberately kept this original slide, kept ongoing. And in a bit more detail, you see here that there were only basically 2 moments of exception. The first one is this one. Any guess? This is the moment of exception. In record countries, it goes down. It is the flu, indeed. H1N1, 1918-19. This killed more people, as many of you know, than the 2 European civil wars together, about 65 million people. But there may be an iron law of mortality, but it went up again quite quickly. Then there is a moment of exception here. This is only in men. This is myocardial infarction, heart attacks, acute coronary syndrome, as we would say now. But also there, cardiology, preventive cardiology got things on the track again, going on, living 1 week and gaining 1 weekend. By the way, there's another little observation I had not seen, not originally, but this suggests that perhaps the difference now, all countries have this, of about 5 years in life expectancy was not always there, perhaps. Has not been studied very much by demographers, but perhaps deserves that. Now, this is the type of big picture that we study. And as I will have this slide back to you, as I said, until now. This is another type of big picture. This is prevalence, existing cases of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. In a Rotterdam study, not necessarily the best study, but a study I know best, and we published this now many years ago, simply the frequency. And you see when you look at 95 or over, given what we just saw in terms of development of longevity, many of us may make that 95, then it's approximately, a bit less perhaps, a 1 in 2 chance that you will be diagnosed with dementia or Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease in this type of analysis, about 75% of that. That led, of course, us at that time in this study at Rotterdam, but later in another place, to focus on the etiology of Alzheimer's disease. Not that that was early, because we were referring to this at that time already epidemic as the silent epidemic. In the early 90s of the last century, there was not much emphasis, with an exception that I will show you in a minute. Here, now, we decided to focus on the etiology, studying the incidence of the disease. That is the key thing. If you look at prevalence, existing cases, you're very likely to be on the wrong footing at some point. So incidence, new cases, incidence rate in particular, if possible, of dementia. And we did that in the Alzheimer Cohort Consortium, and that included 9 population-based cohorts. Very important that it's population-based. Then the major sources of selection bias that can, again, put you on the wrong footing are not there, hopefully, if there's not too much of selection in the population base to begin with. But that was the reason why we do this. And the Alzheimer Cohorts Consortium, 9 prospective population-based cohort studies. They were sample sizes of at least 3,000 at the beginning. And there were similar methods, that's very important, of the assessment of dementia. Here are the 9 studies. in order of alphabet, not necessarily in order of start ages, the Reykjavik study, but mainly done from the US, from the NIA. The atherosclerosis risk and community studies, ERIC studies, strong, ongoing. The only study, basically, I think, Sudha, that has more than one ethnicity. It has deliberately focused on others. Cardiovascular health study in the US, CFAS here in Britain from Cambridge, the Framingham Heart Study, the Gothenburg's population studies, obviously in Sweden, the Paquet study, the oldest population-based study, just a year older in start than the Rotterdam study, and then the 3-study study also in France. Those were the studies that were involved. And what we did there was look at first simple incidence rates overall by age and also, if possible, by gender. And then we looked at whether there was a particular change in the incidence of the disease. Here you see the overall picture of incidence rates, obviously going up in all studies strongly with age, starting at 65 year up till 90. Quite a bit of variation, although the assessments were similar. Still, studies were, of course, different in many senses. Now, one of, I thought, very interesting observation, because it was, to me, I didn't know this at that time, and it was generally not presented, is that there is basically no difference between men and women when you look at the incidence rate of dementia. There's, of course, a very strong difference in prevalence, and that's why if you open the newspapers and when they write about dementia, you will always hear and see that it's more in men than in women than in men. But that is not when you look at the force of morbidity of the disease, the underlying force of the disease. The incidence rate is not different. So the 4 or 5 people who do PhD projects in the US, I'm not sure about Europe, working on gender differences in the incidence of dementia probably will not find very much. No difference, no difference. Here, looked at, this is again overall, but here we have it specified by men and women. As to be expected, you see quite a bit of differences, variation. This is now including 90, and there is the biggest variation in this, generally, I think, because of, even in population-based studies, selective forces. All right, that brought us to, not us is an overstatement, that brought Monique Bretler, who's sitting here, to the question, is there a decline in Alzheimer's disease? And she worked on this with Elisabeth Schrijvers in the Rotterdam study. 2 cohorts compared, 1990 to 2000 and 2000 to 2010. And then changes in the determinants and vascular factors were examined. And then, of course, the incidence of dementia, published in 2012, neurology, about 25% decline per decade in that particular study. 25% decline per decade, both in Alzheimer's disease as a subcategory and in overall dementia. Then, very beautifully, this was done in the Framingham study, somewhat later. Claudio Zabal, and that was the instigator, Sudha Sheshadri. You see them all here, and you will hear them today. Looked at this in Framingham, and Framingham had a bit more data because the Framingham study, 75 years old now, ladies and gentlemen, 75 years old, still going on and strong, had data about 30 years and looked at this and found basically the same, 20% or so decline per decade, 3 decades in that case, 30%, 20% decline per decade in both Alzheimer's disease, and a bit more actually in vascular dementia. When we look now at those 2 studies combined with others in the Alzheimer cohorts consortium, you see them here. Overall decline, a bit less than 20% or so. This is in all case dementia. And if you look at Alzheimer's disease, but similar, not so much different in this overall analysis. This is up till 2015. So this is and that's quite important, perhaps does not include data on the last years, the pandemic years, which we'll discuss perhaps a bit later, is of importance in this context. If you look now more among men, perhaps a bit larger the effect than on women, perhaps also to be discussed. So in conclusion, when you look at this way of looking at the big picture, epidemiologic way of looking at the big picture in Alzheimer's disease and dementia, no difference between men and women, by and large, in incidence rate, very big differences in prevalence, but that's because of difference in longevity. And the incidence of dementia in Europe and North America, we did not study it in other cohorts, they were not there, now they are. It was a decline of between 15 and 20 or so % per decade. Good news, therefore, and not very different in my assessment between dementia overall and Alzheimer's disease. And as you can imagine, lots of people involved, including our colleagues from Imperial. See here, but many others. It takes a long time to have this. We published this in the end of 2020. It got attention in the US, but remarkably enough, remark is probably not remarkable, not so much in Europe, because there was a pandemic going on, and so 2 pandemics at the same time, that's a bit much. It is very good that, for particularly the Financial Times and the BBC, took it up again. So the Financial Times, what is it, 2 weeks ago, rediscovered this and put emphasis on this and presented it, I think reasonably so, as a piece of good news in this, and asked the question, of course, why is this? Why do we see this decline? And we may speculate on that at another moment. I want to bring you then now further to the Hippocratic questions that I have, a discussion of the big picture, amongst others. And this goes to my second part of the talk, which has not so directly to do with dementia and Alzheimer anymore, but more with my overall questions. How are we doing in epidemics? Here are the four questions. If you look now at the main question that we have addressed in terms of methods over the past, I would say 30, 40 years, we very much have gone from description, from trying to see what is the big picture, how much disease is there, what is the burden of disease. In epidemiology, I focused much more on analysis and particularly in the context of causal inference. Is this association that we see, is that a causal association? Very reasonable, very important question. I already say in my assessment, we have been enormously successful in this over the past 30, 40 years, but at some price. How did we do this? Well, we have something to celebrate, and we didn't. First, people say there are other moments, but I think the book of people who really look at randomized controlled trials, it is 1948 that the first one was published. British Medical Journal, Austin Bradford Hill, streptomycin and pulmonary tuberculosis, and he did the randomization himself. He got essentially had a big head and 75 years ago. 75 years ago. We still have 6 weeks to celebrate this, and perhaps we should put some emphasis on that. Very important moment, I think, given that if you open now this week's Lancet or New England Journal of Medicine or so, at least half of the papers are randomized trials in various forms, that we have various variation on this. It is not too much to ask, I think, to celebrate this. Then, causal thinking in the health sciences. Perhaps you do not all know this. Mervyn Susser, refugee from South Africa, working at Columbia. Beautiful book. First treatment of causal inference in epidemiology and in medicine, I think, in many senses at large. Theoretical Epidemiology of Miettinen. Very important book. Some people say that this is the start of modern epidemiology. Perhaps not the book, which was published in 1985, but paper Estimability and Estimation in Case Reference Studies, American Journal of Epidemiology. If you know that paper, you know really the core of the start of modern epidemiology. Then counterfactual prediction. Jamie Robbins, 1986, very, very important new stream of causal inference thoughts. And then, this is my final now for this one, George Davy Smith and others, of course, instrumental variables applied in medicine under the genomic heading of Mendelian randomization, and has been really, really very influential. Of all the, I'm the editor of a European Journal of Epidemiology, 2,000 papers a year. Currently, 600 a year are having in the title Mendelian randomization. It's absolutely astonishing, 30%, many from China. So yes, this was going from description very successfully to analysis, indeed. And then this was in methods. What did we do in causes? Well, this is a general slide you can always use. Genes, environmental causes, and interaction. Okay, why would we study in epidemiology focused on public health, perhaps community medicine? Why would we study genes? People ask that. One of my main colleagues at the time, at the end of the last century, when you know the revolution, genomics revolution started, said, no, we shouldn't do that. There's no need to do this in the nurses' health study and so on, because you can change genes on the population level. That's not very relevant. They changed their mind, thank God. And the reason for us at and quite a number of other places to do this, because we wanted to remember the discussion of Robert Koch and Max von Pettenkofer. This is the end of the 19th century. This is when Max von Pettenkofer, look at the frontispiece of the London School of Hygiene and Medicine, he is there. And Max von Pettenkofer was the most celebrated epidemiologist, hygienist, and said, yeah, Vibrio comma, yeah, cause of cholera, yeah, maybe, but many other causes. And Koch said, well, maybe there may be many other causes, but the big one is the Vibrio comma that I found. And they had a big discussion about this. And of course, Koch won, and it won in the sense that from say the second half of the 19th century until the 1930s, epidemiology disappears. You don't find it in the Lancet Index anymore or in the New England Journal of Medicine. So for about 50 years, it was not there. It started again with Jerry Morris, first paper on then. And so I thought, let's not have the same mistake as epidemiologists. Let's link to people in the lab, and let's see whether we can play a role in the genomic revolution. And I think that really works in the sense that it is Robert Koch, Berlin. This is Max von Pettenkofer. He committed suicide because of the big disaster that happened in an epidemic in Hamburg. It's from Munich. What did we do in Alzheimer's disease? Well, first, of course, family history studies, case control studies. Do you have a first-degree member of with Alzheimer's disease, as in the cases and in the controls? Odds ratio of about 3 to 4 or so suggests that it runs in families, not necessarily genetic, may also be nurture, of course. But the very important other observation was another epidemiologic one. In trisomy 21, in Down syndrome, you see a very big accumulation early in life of plaques and tangles in the brain. And that observation led John Hardy to look at chromosome 21. You can take any chromosome to look at genes at that time. There was no genome-wide association study at that time. And he did so, and many of his colleagues, and published in Nature the first gene, the amyloid precursor protein gene, a missense mutation in that on chromosome 21. Very, very, very important observation. In this case, by the way, I always say this, there are more authors than patients involved, but we shouldn't say this anymore. After the genome-wide association studies, it was 120 authors, of course. Very important observation. First one, 1991. That was basically, I think, the start of, outside of epidemiology, and epidemiology started at about the same time of the upswing that Abbas rightfully referred to, the upswing in research in Alzheimer's disease and dementia. Then we got genome-wide association studies, very, very much with involvement of epidemiologists, in fact, generally pushed by epidemiologists. And then we wanted, so we find many, many genes. I'm not sure what in Alzheimer's disease, the current count is 40 to 50 or so, but many, many. And of course, also we study not only gene environment interaction, but particularly also gene-gene interaction to study particular pathways. We'll hear about this, I'm sure, today very, very much. In gene-environment interaction, clearly one of the main topics of research for the coming decades in epidemiology and in medicine at large, perhaps, I could not resist to show you this person. This is the person that first described in a robust, what we would now think as a very, very good, reasonable way, interaction in the way that we see it now. Anybody knows who this is? This is the young Max von Pettenkofer. You saw him back at the end of his life. This is as a young professor at Munich, or perhaps even he was still at Heidelberg. And he described in the Zeitschrift für Biologie, Boden und Grundwasser in der Beziehung zu Cholera, soil and water, and a connection with cholera, 1869. And it took us a century to get further in this. Ken Rothman, Olli Miettinen, and now, sorry that I'm speaking pro domo, but Tyler van der Wele wrote, I think, the book, at least until now, 2015, Methods for Mediation and Interaction with Oxford University Press. Very, very impressive book, which has everything that you want to know on that, given the current state. All right. Now, let's go back to our big picture and overall questions. Again, the big picture. I told you we were not particularly early in finding this decline in Alzheimer's disease and dementia. Monique Bretler was the first, yes, but it was also 20 years after the fact. I'm not sure, Monique, that you could have been much earlier in this case, but 20 years, and then now seeing it 10 years later or so, gradually people grasp this, and perhaps there's now a bit of change. We're not very early in this, but in Alzheimer's disease, I don't think we were the worst. Here is the slide I showed you before. 2 moments of exception, I said, yes. But now we have a third moment of exception, particularly in the US, but perhaps also in some other countries. This is taken from a deposition at the US Senate by 2 economists, not epidemiologists, economists, Ann Case and Angus Deaton. Okay, not the least of economists, Angus Deaton, British, but working at Princeton, a Nobel Prize winner in his field, looked at mortality and looked at decline in mortality, therefore increase in longevity in various countries, and compared this to what in a subgroup in this case of the US, and saw that in the US there was not a decline in mortality, and this started already in 1995, early 90s of the last century, but there was actually an increase in mortality. They phrased the term death of despair because they said it has to do with legal opioids, oxycodone, and illegal others, fentanyl now in particular. This is taken from a slide from the New York Times that they published on. And this led to overdose number of deaths in 20 US. As I said, it had already been going on for over 25 years, but in 2019 it was 70,000. In 2020, it was 94,000. 2021 was 108,000. 2022, 120,000. There are many things wrong in the US, but counting death we are reasonably good at. This is, I think, accurate. Point of reference, gun death in the US, a lot, 50,000 a year. Of those, 2/3 are suicide. 2/3 are suicide. The US way to kill yourself is suicide. In Europe, it's another way. Okay. Not much difference, by the way, in suicide rates. That's very interesting in itself. So 15,000 gun deaths, basically, and 120. The total number of COVID deaths estimated now in the US. Here at Imperial, there are people who know the count better, but I guess it's about 1 million. But this is, for an average person with COVID, losing 4 years of life. Total 4 million years of life lost. This is of average people of 40 years of life lost. So every year, 40 times, say, 100,000 or so, is the same amount every year as years lost during the pandemic. And we didn't see this before 2015 or 16 or so. And epidemiologists didn't pick it up. There are a few spotted things, suggestions, but not really. Economists picked it up after 20 years. We lost the game of the big picture. We are not very good, it seems, at this anymore. Let me show you a little bit now. Very recently, Case and Angus Deaton published this also again in the New England Journal of Medicine, in the New York Times. You see here the effect that it has on life expectancy in the US. It levels off in many countries over the last years. This is Portugal. Britain has the next to the US, the steepest perhaps decline. It's a very important thing also from a point of view of Alzheimer's disease, because if you see now that there is no decline perhaps in Alzheimer's disease anymore, I think it has to do with the fact that there is really this increase in mortality. And so therefore we will have to study that, but a recent paper that came from ELSA, from one of the studies here in Britain, suggested that there may be a leveling off of that, and that may have to do with that. You see also what the consequence is if you dichotomize. This is not just a up 10% or lower 10%. No, you dichotomize the American population, you have close to 10 years of the difference in life expectancy, dichotomized. If you do Britain, upper 10% and lower 10%, it probably is also something like that, but not when you make it in two categories. Absolutely astonishing. Okay, so it's very much related to level of education, not so much income or other socioeconomic characteristic, but seems education, the cognitive stratification of our societies, which is really, really one of the things that have been going on, particularly in the past 30, 40, 50 years, have enormous consequences. Are there big other failures? Well, lung cancer, celebrated case in epidemic. Yes, started in the end of the 19th century, started to being studied in the mid of the 20th century after 50 years. And then 20 years about later or so, we came to the conclusion that smoking causes lung cancer. It was not very fast either, I must say. Then the current epidemic in chronic diseases is that of diabetes mellitus. I think you will realize that that's a big one. It's particularly related to obesity, but not only that. If you look now in those age 65 or over in a general population, you find that 1 in 3 or so, but in the US even more, suffer from type 2 diabetes. Very, very big. We were not very early in seeing this. Not at all, actually. Particularly not a remarkable link between, as a consequence of obesity. Then this one, the decline in heart disease. I remember that, I'm sure that Dr. Elliott knows this as well, that Dr. Stamler, Jeremiah Stamler, one of the greatest in our field, particularly in cardiovascular epidemiology, in around 1985 said, well, there is a decline in heart disease. Look, wonderful. And I remember that one of his great colleagues, Professor Jeffrey Rowe, said, yes, we clearly did something right, except we don't know what. I remember that very vividly. This had been going on for 20 years already. So we're not very good, not very early there in this particular field either. So we, may I say this, have gone from description to analysis, perhaps lost a bit the way to find the big picture, to see the big picture. How was it in COVID? I have to be very careful. Not my field at all. What is our function? This is our function. Let me give you my summary. This is what is worse. This is not worse very much, but I think the jury is still out. We do not know how well we did. But it's very important that we do particularly this well at the beginning, because we talk now about pandemic preparation, but I think most people who are in there think, well, prepare. It's pandemic management. And in pandemic management, early management is key. Early management is key. And therefore, early knowing this well is very, very important. And I'm not absolutely sure we were so well. There's a very, very important big group here at Imperial Infectious Disease, wonderfully working on that. There's one in Seattle. We have one at Harvard. Overall assessment, probably we could have done better. We did not have surveillance data. We did not have surveillance. There was only one country that had surveillance data, Luxembourg. Not enough. Britain was very quick in catching up, I must admit that. And Imperial played, and Paul and the whole people who worked on COVID here in Britain did much better. I say this on the authority of my infectious disease colleagues at home, did much better than in the US, but still perhaps not early enough. So again, there, we should perhaps put descriptive epidemiology, surveillance in place. Therefore, summary. Sorry that to go so far from Alzheimer's disease, but it has something to do with it, I think. We went from description to analysis. Yes, very, very successful. I'm the last person to say that epidemiology is not a wonderfully successful field. It is. It is. In fact, large part, I would say, even of the decline in heart disease and therefore the increase in longevity in most of our countries in the second half of the 20th century is due to epidemiology. We have no focus on mass disease anymore. The diagnosis is not there. We lost this idea of surveillance and looking at how big it is. It is perhaps because we like it more to focus on abstract knowledge rather than particularistic knowledge. We think we want to find laws of nature. Smoking causes lung cancer, rather than what is it that we need in terms of, say, mental health institutions in our population. How much is there needed? Not much on the particularistic, but rather on the abstract. There is, particularly in the US, a very strong separation between clinical and community medicine, separate schools of public health and medical schools. I don't think that's a very great idea. And particularly in the opioid crisis, that has played a very, very poor role. Our colleagues in public health and community medicine did the best they could, but they didn't know what was going on in the hospitals, the oxycodone and so on. Whereas we, as clinicians, we didn't know what was going on in the population, and so therefore hardly any link between the two. And then perhaps also there is a lack of subject matter knowledge. However that may be. Descriptive epidemiology, what can we do? Well, perhaps a renewed emphasis. We are in the School of Public Health here, one of the celebrated, very successful schools of public health here at Imperial. We perhaps need more emphasis on education. I can say for us at Harvard, we have a big education program, hardly any on descriptive epidemiology or on surveillance studies, hardly any. But perhaps now a few days to pick up an acute infection or so, but not systematically. Very, very remarkable, actually. Then we have perhaps more focus on our research on this as well. In summary, we have great successes in, I think, analytic epidemiology, but less so in descriptive epidemiology. And I may leave you with this question: do we need to remedy this? With that, I would thank you very, very much for having me here. It's very enjoyable to be in this environment. I thank again Dr. Abbas Degan and Dr. Paul Elliott. I congratulate you with all your efforts, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Bert. Lecture. Questions?
Thank you for that tour de force. It's less of a question. Yeah, it's a comment, and then perhaps I'd welcome your thoughts. I agree with the challenge that you describe, but I was wondering whether stronger ties between clinical and community medicine, while I take your point about the opioid epidemic, I think that's also part of the problem, because in many systems, including in the US, clinical medicine tends to be a juggernaut. And so what happens is the sort of clinicalization of epidemiology. People think that samples that are in the EHR records or that they are seeing in clinic might be sufficient. And also there has been this focus on individual responsibility, lifestyle, behavior, and moving away from environmental and social factors. It may not be a bad thing that, it may be a harbinger of something that economists are the people to pick up things, because perhaps the right place to pick it up is at national or community level. I'd like your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much. To your last comment, I oscillate myself between two views on this. I like to quote Peter Srabernak in the Lancet many years ago, 80s or so. It is not the business of medicine to make people virtuous, but to save them from the consequences of their vices. That's one clinical medicine view, I think, is perhaps a majority view. There's another view, of course, and Jeffrey Rose put it in this beautiful book, Strategy of Preventive Medicine, Oxford University Press. Read it if you don't know it. It's the best. He put it as the motto: we are all responsible for all. And this, of course, yes, I didn't know it before, so I looked it up and read the book. The brothers Karamazov of Fyodor Dostoevsky, in which the great inquisitor asks the brothers, the two of the three who were there, one was dead already, are we not all responsible for all? We are all responsible for all, isn't it? So that's a bit the oscillation. And I agree with you. I don't know whether if we clinicize epidemiology or epidemiologize clinical medicine, that has that of a consequence. In terms of the focus, yes, I agree with you, particularly if you look at electronic health record, the ease in which big data, and the ease in which this is used, the ease in which, if I may say, clinical samples are big way interpreted, causal inference is lacking there. And proper thought, very often, proper thought, critical thought on where does this come from, where do these data come from, and can we make I agree with that. The solution is not to leave it. The solution is to improve that. May I say this? That is a hard task, by the way, for us, because that is what our task is in epidemiology, and particularly in education, and particularly in medical education. So I strive and push for more epidemiology, particularly in the medical curriculum. I don't know.
Thank you. That was really, really outstanding for a non-epidemiologist. To what extent should we be focusing attention on diversity in populations, particularly the developing world, in order to both enhance our analytical notions by having a greater range of exposures? Surveil and monitor early.
Yes. Thank you very, very much. Two comments here. One, we didn't do this very well in our Alzheimer cohorts consortium because it's by necessity only North America and in fact even the US only and Western Europe. But we should very much, I think, look at heterogeneity. Heterogeneity, diversity, is what we strive on when we study causes. And remember that one of my mentors, main mentor actually, always said, you cannot study the effect of sauna in Finland because everybody has sauna. And so I think this type of striving for looking at as well as you can for various sources of heterogeneity. So look at what Anne Case and Angus Deaton did in simply comparing college, 30% or so, 70% non-college. It's enormously very influential, more than perhaps things that we do when they publish this in the New York Times. Yeah. So thank you. Yes, very much. I agree. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Bert. I really enjoyed your talk, and I just had a reflection or a comment I wanted to make, and really also want to hear your opinion about this, because looking at the history of epidemiology, and you give a very nice overview, that's how the field developed. But if I just take it forward to the current situation, most of the time there's this expectation, this notion that epidemiologists, well, they are the persons working in populations. Then you have the patients and the animal models. Epidemiologists don't work there because epidemiology is epidemics, it's population, large numbers, etc. But there's also this very important notion that as epidemiologists, we are also very strong methodologists. You also give this overview there. And to what extent should we actively strive as the epidemiology community to showcase that we're not just the people doing population research, we actually are, let's say, a foundational building block of any research. For instance, even in, let's say, animal model studies, you'd expect randomization to occur, blinding to occur, proper control for confounding, et cetera, which is very much lacking there, and which is the bread and butter of epidemiologists. How would you kind of bridge this divide, this notion, this expectation people have, and that we as epidemiologists have perhaps kept in place and sustained it?
Thank you very much, Arfan. Thank you very much. I think this is a very key question for the development of epidemiology, our field. The short answer is to get in there, to get close to your clinical colleagues when they design studies and do those studies, and say, well, what is the question there? And can we help in one? Can we help? And not we'll tell you what. No. Can we help? That is, I think, go about this as an overall assessment. Then there are a few comments we can make. Number one, it's a shocker for many people in clinical medicine that when you say epidemiology is the only field that can study causes of disease in the intact human being. There's no other field that can do that because of obvious comparison. Most people wouldn't immediately accept that, and I always invite them to give counter arguments. Pathologists, but that's a bit too late. So epidemiology is basically the only field that can do that. That's number one, as a general observation. And then, perhaps most importantly, in a technical sense, we have the technology for it, particularly in the case control study. We have reviled a bit, lost a bit the idea of a case control study, but it's the only way to study causes in rare diseases. Very, very to use it in a clinical context, and to do this well is very difficult. It's the most difficult type of. I'm quite sure you agree with me. Most difficult design in terms of all kinds of types of bias, but that is a very, very strong weapon that we have in our armamentarium for clinical medicine.
Okay, yes, maybe the last one.
Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I have a question, and I'll explain where the question comes from, and I'm interested in your thoughts. In line with the bigger picture and why epidemiologists are so bad at what we're doing, I like
not in everything what we're doing. I don't summarize everything. No.
Not in everything. I'm interested to know what you think about the field going forward in genetic epidemiology. and the lack of non-European ancestry that is seen and what is known. Reason being that a lot of studies that some studies I've seen in the US looking at African Americans as particularly have seen that the APOE4 allele seems to be quite protective, and that African Americans are about 2/3 ancestry West African Nigerian, and it's finding similar results where what we know about particularly Alzheimer's and risks isn't reflecting. And then also in sub-Saharan Africa, recovering now from the HIV epidemic, our population's getting older. We're seeing a rise in HIV-related dementia. So I would like to know your thoughts on how the field going forward and the bigger picture and what we're missing in those populations that have non-European ancestry.
Thank you very much. It's a bit, so follow-up, so to speak, on the diversity and heterogeneity question. I very much appreciate that. The only thing I can say is that I follow very much the idea that we have to be very much more heterogeneous. I'm part of what is called the Broad Institute in our environment, which is a link between MIT and Harvard University, has a big input of the Harvard School of Public Health and the medical school. There we have had very, very strong emphasis, pushed very much by Eric Lander when he was still the director of the Broad, to go into other populations as well, particularly in Africa. There's now a study called Ginger going on in 17 countries. Try as much as possible to have population-based data there for reasons that I discussed. So there is very, very much emphasis. By the way, it's also criticized. It happens always in one Harvard, one criticizes the other. People say this is neo-colonialism when you do this as the Broad, but I don't buy that. I think it's very, very important to have that type of further information. Yes, I appreciate it.
If I may add to that, as part of the Alzheimer's disease sequencing program, when it began in 2012, the feeling was we'll only take whites because we don't know how to analyze mixed ancestry. But now at the follow-up sequencing effort, one of these efforts is the READ ADSP. And to address that, just building on that, to address the neocolonialism argument that being from a former colony, I'm sensitive to. It's led by Rufus Akinyemi and from Nigeria and multiple other African leaders from 8 nations. I was initially worried about, as you said, the amount of epi in it, because it's easy to do whole genome sequencing, but you need to make sure that they are carefully phenotyped. And I think that's a work in progress, and I take your point about, and same for, I think, South America. Not enough, but about a lot. I think we'll have about 40,000 whole genome sequences from Africa and South America through ADSP in the next year or two.
Okay, thanks. In the interest of time, I think we'd better move to. Thank you very much, Bert. Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to.
Well, that was a terrific opening session, and actually touched on quite a lot of the points of the reason for today's meeting, which is that the epidemiology group here